Hello and welcome. I am Melinda Bates, also known as the Ultimate White House Insider, courtesy of the 8 amazing years I spent as a special assistant to the President and Director, White House Visitors Office, a job I proudly did for President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton. I am, in fact, the first person in history to do that job for all 8 years of any administration. And so while the President and First Lady were making history on the national and international stage, I was making my own bit of history in the House itself, and I'm really proud of that. It was, as you can imagine, the most exciting time in my life. In the Oval Office on the last day, the President said to me, "Melinda, it has been a hell of a deal, and I'm so glad you came along for the whole thing." And I really was too. After the White House, because for years people had been telling me, "Melinda, you need to write a book," I did. Oprah Winfrey sat in my office and said, "Melinda, you should write a book." And here it is, White House Story. It's my memoir, and it is available on Amazon. I hope if you're interested, you may take a look. So when we arrived at the White House, I confess I didn't really know anything about it. And I realized very quickly I was going to have to learn a lot about it because every day I would get a phone call from the Oval Office saying, "Melinda, the President just had a meeting with Tom Hanks. Please come walk him around the house." Or, "Melinda, Hillary just had tea with the Queen of Sweden. Please come walk her around the house." And so I began to frantically assemble a small library of reference books, histories. I frequented used bookstores, and these are long before Amazon, and talked to people, met with experts, did everything I could to become an expert. Those are efforts I began in January of 1993. And here we are in March of 2023, and I am still doing exactly the same thing, always looking for more stories, more graphics, more drawings, more paintings, more things to bring to life the people and the places that I think are the most fascinating in America. So it's my privilege today to be part of Viking's programs. Possibly some of you have seen me before on Viking.TV, where I was interviewed by Ann Diamond. Really appreciate Ann. She's a remarkable interviewer. And so it's my privilege today to bring to you my talks as a leading authority on founding mothers, the revolutionaries. Some of these are women who are famous, like Martha Washington or Abigail Adams, but some of them are women that we don't talk about much in history class in America. And we certainly should, because they are so remarkable, and they were critical to the founding of our country. Without these women, we would not have a revolution. We would certainly not have been the country that we are today. So they're well worth studying, and I find them fascinating, and I hope you will as well. Now, there's some interesting parallels between these many women, and that is that quite often they were older than the men they married, not always, but often. And quite often they came from a higher socioeconomic status than the men they married. And for these reasons, quite often their families disapproved of the match, really didn't want them to marry, but they married anyway. And very often they came from families where their fathers or their brothers or their uncles were engaged in public life. And so they were familiar with public service and what it looked like and how it operated. It was not unusual to them. But there were women living at a time when it was unusual for women to be in public life. And I'd like to start with one of the most amazing women from the colonial era, who sadly I don't remember learning anything about in history classes when I was in school. This is Eliza Lucas, at age 16, lovely, lovely young woman. Eliza was born on the British island of Barbados. Her father was a British military officer stationed there. She had 2 older brothers and a younger sister. And when the older children were of the correct age, they were sent off to England to go to school. And Eliza wrote to her father how much she enjoyed school, and her favorite topic was botany, which was an odd choice for a young woman of her age, but that was what she was interested in. Eventually, she returned to Barbados to be with her family, but her brothers stayed in England to continue their schooling. And while she was there at about age 16, her father received word that he had inherited a lot of land in the colony of South Carolina, 3 plantations, 5,000 acres of land, and the enslaved people to run the plantations, because of course the plantation economy only works if there are enslaved people to manage it and run it and do the labor. So Captain Lucas packed up the family and they went to South Carolina to figure out what they owned and what they were going to do with it. But not too long after they got there, Captain Lucas was called back to his assignment in Barbados. He was going to have to leave. And then they had to decide, well, what will happen to these plantations? Who will stay here? Who will run them? So they made the decision, which I think was actually quite astonishing, to leave Eliza, age 16, in charge of the plantations. Hundreds of acres of land, several hundred enslaved people, the crops, the old people, the young people, and she would be responsible for making sure that the plantations were successful, because the money raised by those plantations was necessary to keep her family going, to support her father's military career, to keep the boys in school in England, and to keep everything going. Huge responsibilities to put on the shoulders of a 16-year-old girl, really quite amazing. But it turned out to have been a brilliant idea, because Eliza turned out to be a brilliant entrepreneur. Who knew? She was absolutely fabulous at what she did. She was a great organizer. She kept a daily journal. It's the only one of its kind, a daily journal of everything that she did on the plantations day by day, what crops they planted, how they were run, who got sick, who died, who needed to be cared for, what supplies they needed to send for. It's an astonishing document of its time. She wanted to be the most successful plantation owner she could be, and at the time, South Carolina's cash crop was rice. So she knew she could grow rice. They did that, but she figured she could do better at something else. So she started experimenting, and one of her experimental crops was silk. She was able to obtain mulberry plants and silkworms, and they were able to produce enough silk to make 3 beautiful dresses, one of which was presented to the Princess of Wales on a visit to London. But it was too difficult, and it was clear that silk production was not going to be her moneymaker. And what she really wanted to do, but had a very difficult time doing, was to grow indigo. Now, indigo is a crop we don't think about at all in the modern era. We might use the word indigo to represent a deep, rich blue, but indigo in the middle of the 18th century was a fabulously valuable crop, because all of the military uniforms across Europe and Russia that were blue were dyed with indigo. And hard to grow, hard to produce. So it was extremely valuable. And in fact, the Spanish king at one point said that it was more valuable than silver to the Spanish crown. And it equaled eventually 1/3 of all the Carolina exports. But again, it was very difficult to grow. It was difficult for her to get the seed. Eventually, her father was able to obtain seed, send it to her. But how do you grow it? She was no expert on this plant. When is the right sowing season? How do you nurture it along? When is harvest? And after you harvest it, how do you process it? Because the dye comes not from the flowers, as you might think, but from the stalks, and they have to be processed in a very specific way. Eventually, I mean, she had so much trouble. The first year, she planted at the wrong time. The second year, there was an unseasonable frost. The third year, she planted and harvested, but they didn't really know what they were doing to process, so the crop was spoiled. But eventually, Eliza was able to locate an enslaved woman who knew how to grow and process this plant. And together, they raised a successful crop and processed it correctly. And now they had indigo. This was a major accomplishment. From this first crop, Eliza began to grow more and more and became extremely successful at producing indigo. And because she was a loyal subject of the crown, at least in the beginning, she sent it off to England, and because she was a good neighbor, she made sure to share her knowledge and her seed with her neighbors, so that the entire colony of South Carolina had a new thriving enterprise, the growing of indigo. And at one point, they produced so much of it, they sent over 100,000 pounds of indigo by cargo ship back to England. So it was hugely successful. If Eliza had had a normal family operation going there with mother and father present with her, she would have been forced as a young woman to marry a suitable young man, and he would have taken over control of everything, and she would have been the mistress of the household. But because she didn't have that arrangement at home, her father at some distance could only make some suggestions which she felt free to ignore. Eliza didn't have to marry until she was good and ready. And when she was good and ready, she married a neighbor, a longtime family friend, Mr. Pinckney, and they produced some children, one of whom eventually was a signer of the Constitution of the United States. When Eliza was a successful plantation owner, like many other owners of plantations in the South and farmers in the Mid-Atlantic and in business owners in the Northeast, she became more and more disenchanted with the way the Crown was treating the colonists. They viewed themselves as loyal subjects of the Crown, the same as if they were a printer with a shop in London or a farmer with land in the Midlands. But the Crown did not treat them that way. The Crown treated them, in their view, in a very shabby manner, and they certainly objected quite vehemently to the taxes that were imposed upon them that were not imposed on similar people working in England. And they agitated for relief, which they could not get. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But when eventually it became clear that the only solution was going to be revolution, Eliza was one of the people who pushed the men very hard to separate, to agree to declare independence. And once independence was declared, she was an extremely important provider of supplies for the troops. So everything that her plantations could produce in terms of food and clothing or whatever was shipped off to the troops. And she was so important to the war effort that the British hated her, and they hunted her from house to house. They burned her plantations down around her. By the end of the war, she was actually impoverished. But she worked so passionately to support the war effort and to make independence happen and to support the forming of the new country that when she finally died, George Washington insisted on being a pallbearer at her funeral. And she was extremely important to the early economy and then to the revolution and then to the forming of the country. But again, started off as a 16-year-old and again, a woman who we don't really discuss in history, and I think we really should. I find her story so inspiring. Here's what those uniforms look like. You can see the blue. That was all dyed with indigo. This is her son, who became a signer of the Constitution of the United States, looking quite fine there, looking rather like George Washington, if you think about it, with the long nose. We don't talk much in history either about Mercy Otis Warren, and she was an amazing person. Mercy was a brilliant woman and a very talented writer, but she lived at a time when women could not write opinion pieces in the local newspapers because that was inappropriate. So Mercy solved that problem by writing pamphlets, which were widely distributed, and plays. And in her plays, Mercy relentlessly mocked the British soldiers who were stationed in the colonies. She made fun of them in her pamphlets. She pushed the men ruthlessly that it was time to separate, that the colonies needed to be independent, that could no longer be subjects of the Crown, that this was not working, that the Crown did not view them correctly. She relentlessly pushed them. When revolution was declared, when we finally decided to declare our independence, Mercy decided to make a history of the war, and she kept a day-by-day history of the Revolutionary War, which is an astonishing document for historians to have. So here's one of her provocative plays, The Adulterer. As I said, the plantation owners, the farmers, the business owners in New England had begun to be very dissatisfied with their treatment by the government of England. But they were just sure that the king had no idea how badly they were being treated. And if they would just inform the king about what was going on, that he would come to their aid. He would cause the government to back off and be more understanding and be more generous with them. So all they needed to do was inform the king. So they put together this petition, which listed all of their grievances for all the things that they wanted the king to resolve for them. And they sent it off to London, where I suppose it landed with a thud on the desk of some bureaucrat, because I highly doubt that the king ever saw it, and there was no answer from anyone. There was no relief from them. So they waited patiently, but not that patiently, because the following year, 1775 to 76, there was a Second Continental Congress, and Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson composed the famous Declaration of Independence. It had become clear that our only course forward was separation and to become a country of our own. And again, behind the scenes, some of these women were passionately encouraging and, in fact, prodding the men to do this. So Abigail Adams, who we're going to talk to about in a moment, wrote to John at this point. And I don't normally have a lot of text in my slides, but for this particular talk, I wanted to do this so that you could see these people in their own words and the things that they wrote to each other, and they wrote about their situations. And Abigail wrote to John, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose necessary for you to make, I desired for you to remember the ladies and be more generous than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Oh, that's a cynical view. "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Well, that was a wonderful sentiment, but in fact, the ladies were not written either into the Declaration of Independence or into the Constitution. But you can see that behind the scenes, Abigail knew she had her own very strong opinions and views, and she was constantly sharing them with John and pushing John in a certain direction. So it became inevitable that we separate when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for our people and so forth. So Congress declared independence, and this was an insanely brave step because, of course, we were deciding to go to war with the world's greatest army and navy, and we had no national army, and we had a very small navy. We had local militias in the colonies, but no army or navy. It was a very dangerous and it was a perilous thing to do. It took tremendous courage. They understood that they were risking everything, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And in fact, they were, because when war was declared, the British went after everyone. Now, we're all familiar, at least in America, we're all familiar with these portraits of Martha and George Washington, very famous portraits of them. I don't know why the history books all focus on our founding fathers and mothers as old people, because in fact, they once were young. Here is Martha. Martha was a hottie. Martha Washington was an adorable young woman, Martha Dandridge. She was from a moderately prosperous family in the colony of Virginia, not, really an important family, but she was a lovely young woman. She was a little headstrong, but that's all right when you're young. And she had a delightful and sparkling personality. Eventually, Martha met Mr. Daniel Custis. They fell in love and they wanted to marry, but there was a problem. Daniel Custis's father was the richest man in the colony of Virginia. And because he was so rich, he was extremely cynical about all of the young women that Daniel had brought home and showed an interest in. The older Mr. Custis just believed that all of these women were only after Daniel's money, and he would not allow Daniel to marry until Daniel brought Martha home. And Martha was so charming and engaging and delightful that the older Mr. Custis agreed, and so she married Daniel Custis. They were young, they were in their late teens, early 20s. They started a nice family. They were very happy together. Unfortunately, Daniel unexpectedly died young. He died not long after their last child was born. No one had expected this. Now, because it was so unexpected and because he was so young, Daniel died without a will. If he had written a will, it would undoubtedly have left his property to Martha, but in the care of a trustee. A man would have been in charge of her life, would have dictated what money she could have and to spend and how she could spend it, how her properties were run, what profits were made and where they were used and so forth. A man would have been in charge of all of this for Martha because she was just a little widow lady and clearly would have needed a smart man to take charge for her. But because there was no will, Martha inherited everything outright. And that made her the richest woman in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia. So Martha, now a rich young widow, meets George Washington. This is a reconstruction of his face done by the Mount Vernon Association, and it's thought to be quite accurate. And you can see how handsome he was. George came from a not particularly distinguished family, or no real money, but he had a couple of advantages, which were that he was over 6 feet tall at a time when most men were barely 5'10". So he stood out in a crowd. He could ride very well. He could hunt. He was a wonderful conversationalist. He was a wonderful dancer. At all of the parties and balls, he would dance with all of the ladies, not just the pretty ones. So George was highly sought after as a social companion. And you can see how handsome he was. I would have been drawn to him myself, I am sure. George had as friends Colonel and Mrs. Fairfax. They were his very dear friends. And there is a series of correspondence between George and Sally that, if read by modern eyes and ears, would appear to be an exchange between lovers because the language is very passionate, very intimate. But in fact, no one thinks that George would have had an affair with his best friend's wife. He was always too honorable for any kind of thing like that. And also because that intimate language was simply the norm. That was how people wrote to each other at the time. When independence was declared, Colonel and Mrs. Fairfax decided that they were loyal subjects of the crown. They packed up, went back to England, and were not heard of again. I wonder what they thought when George eventually became father of his country and our first president. So George and Martha meet in Virginia and they court each other. Mrs. Custis is only 25. And when you are the richest woman in the colony, you can afford beautiful gowns and wonderful fabric to make gowns and the imported best of everything. And look at how lovely they are as a couple here. So they married. It must have been the wedding of the century in the middle of the 18th century in Virginia. Hugely important. And they went off to live. There are Martha's 2 surviving children. And they went off to live at Mount Vernon, which was George's property. Now, you may wonder, as President Trump once did, why the property was called Mount Vernon instead of Mount Washington. President Trump visited there with Mrs. Trump, I think in the last year of his presidency, and asked a perfectly sensible question. Why isn't it called Mount Washington? And that is because George inherited this property from his brother Lawrence. His brother had served with an officer named Vernon and had named the property after this man that he so admired. And out of respect for his dead brother, George kept the name Mount Vernon, and that is why it has been named that ever since, not Mount Washington. So here they are at home. And it was not a very grand plantation when George had it by himself, but when Martha came with her money, they were able to really improve the property quite a bit. Possibly some or many of you have visited Mount Vernon. It is a beautiful Virginia plantation house on a bluff overlooking the Potomac River, not that far from the city of Washington, D.C. It's really quite lovely. Well, they settled down there and they were very happy. I will say that over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century, the property shockingly became very run down. And it was not men who decided to raise money and save Mount Vernon, the home of our most important founding father, but rather it was women who got together, raised the money, and restored Mount Vernon. So thank you again to the ladies. Now, when war was declared, of course, the Continental Congress realized, well, we're going to have an army, and that means we're going to have a commander-in-chief of the army. Who should that be? As it happened, Colonel Washington had this very fine uniform from being in the Virginia militia, and he wore that on every possible occasion. So there he was at the Continental Congress in his very fine-looking uniform, and so obviously he was the correct choice to be the commander-in-chief. He was the one they knew, and he definitely looked the part. But it was not just superficial. He was actually an extremely capable commander, because within a matter of, say, 6 months, he had raised, trained, and provided for an army of 60,000 men. So this was quite an accomplishment for George as commander-in-chief. Now, he said he didn't want this. He was motivated highly by duty. And I'm not able to actually see this entire quotation from my screen, but he wrote to her that I am now set down to write you on a solution that fills me with inexpressible concern. This is aggravated and increased when I reflect on the pain I know it will give you. It has been determined that the whole army raised for the defense of our cause shall be put under my care, and that it is necessary for me to proceed immediately to Boston to take upon me the command of it. You may believe me, my dear Patsy, his affectionate nickname for Martha, when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from my seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a consciousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity, and that I should enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad if my stay was to be 7 times 7 years. So he writes here that he was reluctant to take on this huge responsibility, and that he did so only out of duty, and that he understood the sacrifices that not only he but she would have to make in the course of that duty. It was a very solemn assignment. He left Mount Vernon in order to do that, and then did not return to his beloved home for 8 years, except for one very brief visit during that time. For 8 years, he was at war, he was in congresses, for 8 years he was gone. But that did not mean that Martha didn't see him, because at the end of each growing season, when the harvest had been collected and all the riches of the land had come in, she would pack up every extra thing she could lay her hands on that the enslaved people could put together, all of the foodstuffs, but also all of the scarves and hats and socks that they had been frantically knitting all year. And she would bring them to wherever George was stationed with his army, because by and large, the armies didn't fight that much in winter. They would be bivouacked someplace, and she would come and join them there. And so this is a contemporary picture of Martha aiding the soldiers who were freezing in the bitter winter of 1778 in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And the soldiers were so grateful to her for all the things that she did for them that they were constantly referred to her as Lady Washington. And that is a title that stuck with her throughout her life. Eventually, peace is declared. A peace treaty is signed in Paris. Mr. Hartley, Mr. Adams, Mr. Franklin, Mr. John Jay, a peace treaty is signed. And now you'd think maybe George could go home, but he wrote this very moving and very famous address in his farewell to his officers. It is a heart full of love and gratitude that I take my leave of you. I most devoutly wish that our later years may be as prosperous and happy as your former have been glorious and honorable. The very famous part of his farewell address. And then he went home to Mount Vernon, where he hoped, I think, to have perhaps a quiet life, but that was not to be. because the new Congress was meeting to form a constitution. How are we going to govern ourselves? Mercy Otis Warren wrote, "We are too poor for a monarchy, too wise for despotism, and too dissipated, selfish, and extravagant for republicanism." That is a fairly grim view, Ms. Warren. Will we have a constitution? Well, we did have a constitution. And of course, with a constitution, you have the forming of a government. Who's going to be the head of the government? It was decided that we would have one person functioning as the head of state and the head of government. In Great Britain, for example, the Queen is the head of state, the Prime Minister is the head of government. But in America, we have one person, the president, who is both of those things together. And so they decided they would have a president, and who could possibly be the first president other than George Washington, the successful commander of the successful armies and navies and the founding father of his country. So George was elected president, and I really think he didn't want it. He really wanted to be able to give up public life. He had been in service to his country so far all these years through great privation and difficulty, and now he wanted to go home, but it was not to be. About 10 o'clock, I bade adieu to Mount Vernon and to domestic felicity, and with a mind oppressed with anxious and painful sensations, more than I have words to express, I set out for New York. He was a reluctant politician, if you can imagine such a thing. And Martha wrote, "I am truly sorry to tell that the general is gone to New York. When and whether he will ever come home again, God only knows. It was not to be avoided." She too was motivated by an intense sense of duty and service. They owed this, even after all of the service they had given, they continued to be bound by duty. So George went off to New York and was sworn in. Martha was not there. She was at home at Mount Vernon. And he, oddly, they said that when he made his address, he was so soft-spoken that the people in the crowd, which would have been off to the left there, were barely able to hear him. But the important people heard him, and he was sworn in as president. He took up residence in New York City at a very nice house. This is the Presidential Manor at Cherry Street in New York. And then he wrote to Martha that all was ready and she needed to come and join him. So she did. And she arrived at New York City by ship. And she was met by enormous crowds everywhere. Everyone wanted to see the president's lady, the most famous woman in America. So she came and she was settled into their very nice house. And I love this particular painting because it is not just a pretty picture of ladies in their nice dresses and a tribute to the artist's ability to paint satin. No, this painting represents a deep philosophical debate that started at the very beginning of our founding and continues even to this day. And that debate is about our public behavior. How does a president, how do our public officials behave in a way that is appropriate for a head of state, but is not too much like a king or an emperor? He has to behave with respect and dignity, but he's not a king, he's not an emperor. We can't veer over into assuming that our government, our head of state, should look anything like a royal court. The president could not do this. They actually debated how often it was appropriate for the president to entertain. Alexander Hamilton thought, oh, 4 times a week was, that would be fine. John Adams, a New Englander, said, oh, 2 or 3 times a week would be fine. And President Washington's entertainments were a rather sedate form. They were called levées, and they were nothing like what Martha is doing here, but they were certainly the most desirable entertainments and events for any American of the era. But here you see Martha, and if she is not looking like a queen, I don't know what else you could call it. She is definitely looking and behaving like a queen, accepting guests at her court. But because she is not the president, she is the spouse of the president, it was acceptable for her to behave that way. And because everyone knew and loved her title of Lady Washington, again, it was acceptable for her to be acknowledged that way and treated like a queen. George, they had a lot of trouble with George's title. They wanted to call him His Majesty. There were people who would have wanted to make him a king. Fortunately, he was not interested in that. At one point, his aide introduced him to a group of people as His High and Mightiness, the President of the United States. But George was so outraged by that after the event, he took his aide by the lapels, got in his face and said, "You have taken me by surprise this once, sir, but by God, it shall not happen again." And so it took a while for them to settle on simply the president, Mr. President. But the First Lady, that title was not until the early 20th century. So here is Martha entertaining at court. And if you think this debate is only for our much older history, perhaps some of you are old enough to remember Richard Nixon's administration. And during his time in the White House, for who knows what reason, President Nixon decided to change the uniforms of the Secret Service officers into something that really resembled the Swiss Guard at the Vatican. And they were so ridiculous, they were so inappropriate for a president, for the White House, that it was just laughed to bits, and within a week they were back to their regular somber uniform. So that's a very modern example of this debate we have. How do our officials behave in a manner that represents their authority, their respect as head of state, but we are not kings, we do not have emperors. Eventually, after 8 years, George was able to retire. He could have run for a third term, but fortunately for the future, he decided not to. So he set an example, and no other presidents have run for a third term other than Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. I'm sure he felt he was necessary to carry out the successful completion of the war, but everyone else has stuck to 2 years because that was Washington's example. But if he thought he would have a quiet life at Mount Vernon, he and Martha, he was sadly mistaken, because hundreds of people came to visit them. Everyone wanted to see the most famous couple in America. They came by the droves, and they came expecting to be fed. Sometimes, quite often, they expected to be put up overnight. They came so often that George eventually ran out of patience. He would sit with guests at lunch and converse pleasantly, but as soon as luncheon was over, the midday meal, he would retire to his study, he would close and lock the door and become unavailable. No more talking. And here he is with his most important and distinguished visitor, the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to present the key to the Bastille to President Washington. And that key still hangs on display in the hallway of Mount Vernon. If you have been there, you may have seen it. In 1799, Washington finally died. He probably died of a throat infection. The reports of his illness are pretty gruesome. It was a horrible death. His widow survived him, but she did a terrible thing, terrible for history. When the president died, she took all of their letters, all of their correspondence over the decades of their lives together, their private lives, their public lives, their thoughts about the people they worked with, their friends, their opponents, how the war was going. All of this correspondence Martha took and burned. She destroyed all of it. There's only one letter that survived. It was lost in the back of a desk drawer. That's the only reason that it survived. And so I'm sure she wanted to protect their privacy after they were gone. They probably had written opinions that might not have been so popular with people if they had been read. But what a sad thing this is for history, that she burned all that correspondence. Now, a very strange thing happened upon Washington's death. Everyone had assumed that his will was going to free all of his enslaved people when he died. But he didn't write that in his will. Rather, his will said that his enslaved people would be freed when Martha died. Now imagine, here's this little widow woman, elderly woman, living in this beautiful big plantation house, surrounded by guests, yes, but also surrounded by hundreds of people who understand that upon her death, they will finally be set free. Do you think that might have been an uncomfortable situation? I kind of think it might have been, although certainly she was safe and nothing untoward happened. When she finally did pass away, her country honored her by putting her face on a stamp. She's the first woman to be honored with her picture on a stamp. Again, we have founding fathers and mothers who we are accustomed to seeing in versions of their older lives. Here are Abigail and John Adams. But again, like all of us, they were young ones. So here are Abigail and John young. And Abigail was a lovely young woman. She came from a family that had some social status. Her family were preachers, ministers, and they were highly regarded and well known. They were a prosperous family. John, not so much. John met Abigail when Abigail's brother invited him to lunch at the family home. They met and they courted. And again, here's a young woman whose family did not approve of the match because he was beneath her in social standing and certainly beneath her economically. However, he was able, as a young lawyer, to still provide for her, I think, rather well, because here is Peacefield, which is the home that they moved to, and you can still visit it today. It's a lovely New England house, Massachusetts house. So they settled there, and they were very happy with John as an attorney. But of course, he went into public life very quickly, attending the Continental Congresses and being an extremely part of the push for independence. And Abigail, in the background, was passionately pushing towards independence. And she was an absolute partner to him in everything in life. She was not only his wife and intimate partner and the mother of his children and all that, but she was his political advisor, and she was a very smart advisor until the bitter election of 1800 against his former friend Thomas Jefferson, in which she was too partisan and Adams lost that election. But she was his partner and advisor in everything in life. And he wrote to her, "I must entreat you, my dear partner, in all my joys and sorrows, in the adversity of my life, to take part in every part of the struggle." She was his partner. And as they were trying to figure out what direction the Continental Congress should go, what should the colonists do? And she was encouraging him in every way. But by 1775, when it was becoming a reality, he wrote to her, "In case of real danger, fly to the woods with our children. Give my tenderest love to them and to all." Because he understood the reality that the British, once war was declared, were going to hunt down the signers of the Declaration and their families, and they did. They burned their homes, they wrecked their businesses, they destroyed everything they could, they impoverished them. If they found them, they hanged them, executed them. So John's life was in danger wherever he was. Abigail and the children, they were in danger as well. And so it was a very difficult situation for everyone, very dangerous. And when independence is declared, she writes to John, "Courage I know we have in abundance. I hope we shall not want, but powder, where shall we get a sufficient supply?" She's a very practical New Englander. And then after the loss at Bunker Hill, "I have been distressed but not dismayed. I have felt for my country and her sons. I have bled with them and for them." She is encouraging them. She is telling him that despite this early failure, this early loss, not to be discouraged, that it's just a one-time thing, that there's a long road ahead of them, and it is important to keep up one's courage and to go on. Eventually, in its wisdom, the Continental Congress sends Mr. Adams to Europe as an emissary, especially in France, where the Continental Congress, the independent Congress, needed the support of France. We needed money from France. We needed the French Navy to get involved in our war. And so I'm sorry, I'm not able to read all of this based on the display on my screen, but you can see it. It's about his abilities and the mechanical parts of his business of being ambassador. He's competent, but that is not enough, because he's an ambassador who cannot dance, drink, game, flatter, promise, dress, swear with the gentlemen, and small talk and flirt with the ladies. In short, he has none of those essential arts or ornaments which constitute a courtier. There are thousands who, with a tenth of his understanding and without a spark of his honesty, would distance him instantly in any court in Europe, meaning outdistance him. He did not fit their idea of what the ambassador of a sovereign country should look like or how he should behave. Didn't even know how to flirt with the ladies. How shameful, how sad. During the war, this is what ordinary life would have looked like in the colonies. People lived in relatively small houses with relatively few rooms. Life was very simple. Life was very hard by modern standards. Well, John was sent off to Paris and lived in quite a large mansion provided for him by the government. He wanted Abigail to come and join him, but he questioned her ability to come and experience Paris and possibly have her head turned and then go back to her normal life in New England. That is possible for a lady to be once accustomed to all the fripperies and swells and extravagances of Europe without having her head turned by it. This is after she had been scrimping and sacrificing and saving to put together every penny to send to John to keep him going. So that's a little narrow-minded of John, but I will say that Abigail had the same concerns. She had worried about embarrassing John once she arrived. To be out of fashion is more difficult, more unacceptable than to be seen in a state of nature, by which she meant naked, to which the Parisians are not averse. She was worried about how she would adjust herself. So she moved from her small saltbox house, only 7 rooms in Braintree, to a 30-room mansion in Paris. And this is what she was concerned about, because this was French court dress. And that, yes, that is an enormous sailing ship on top of an enormous wig and a very grand dress indeed. Imagine. I cannot imagine Abigail Adams being willing to wear anything remotely like this. She made an effort to do something certainly more stylish than what she was used to, but not to this extreme. And yes, this is another example of French court dress, and that is the front. And yes, sometimes that was all filled in with lace or gauze, but not always. It was Paris. So eventually the war is won, the Adamses return to America, and Adams is elected vice president. Not something he was particularly excited about. He wrote, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." And honestly, well into the 20th century, that was the case for vice presidents. They were available to be sent overseas if some head of state died and they were needed to show up at a funeral to represent the country, but they really had no significant assignments. And the first change to that I can remember is President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore, who truly were partners. And President Clinton gave Vice President Gore an entire portfolio of important issues that the Vice President was to be responsible for. And that has been the case ever since. You remember Vice President Cheney with President Bush, and Vice President Biden with President Obama, and the vice presidents with Trump, and now President Biden, Vice President Harris. So since Clinton, it has been a very significant office, but for Adams, not so much. But they were resigned because it was their duty. So they moved into quite a nice house, Richmond Hill in New York, and Abigail was happy there. It was a pleasant house in a nice situation. It was a good place for her to be. But eventually the government moved to Philadelphia. Now Adams wins the presidency and she becomes First Lady at age 53. And again, we have this question about, well, what are we going to call her? Martha was Lady Washington, but that's not Abigail's title. So they settled on Mrs. President, which was significantly dignified for the wife of the president, but nothing remotely like a royal title. Eventually the government moved to Philadelphia, and because of the climate or the situation was not a good place for Abigail, who became quite sick and had to go home to Massachusetts to recover for quite a while. And the president was so concerned about her that he left Philadelphia to go home to be with her, and he was accused by his detractors of neglecting the business of the country as president in order to be with his wife, but that was what he did. So eventually, the new city of Washington was formed, taking land from Virginia and Maryland. The new capital city, Washington, District of Columbia. And Adams was to be the first president to move there. Mrs. Adams, when she eventually came, was unenthusiastic, shall we say. She wrote that Washington is a city in name only, while Georgetown is the very dirtiest hole I ever saw. And it really was a slum on the waterfront. But Adams had been told that the White House, having been under construction for 8 years, was finally ready for him to occupy. I don't know what he assumed they meant by ready to occupy, because this is what he saw when he drove up that first day in 1800. A construction site. There were brick kilns, stonemason shops, carpentry shops. There were shanties where the enslaved people lived who were hired out and helped to build the White House. In fact, the first child born at the White House was born to an enslaved woman. And this is a representation of what all of that mess looked like. It was horrible. Probably President Adams thought, well, this is the outside. I'm sure the inside looks better, but no, it was unfinished on the inside as well. The plaster on the walls was wet. The beautiful doors had not been hung. Stairways were not up. There was no furniture because Washington had taken his personal furniture home with him to Mount Vernon. So this mess represents what it was like when he walked inside. He had a desk. He sat down at his desk and worked during that day. And then that night went up to his bedroom, sat down, and with a candle wrote something wonderful to Abigail. He wrote to Abigail, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but wise men ever rule under this roof. And because Abigail and John very carefully kept all of their correspondence, over 2,000 letters covering their time in private life, the time of the Revolution, all of their time separated when he was at war or he was in Europe, their time in government, they saved all of their correspondence, I'm sure knowing that it would be an important record for history. And that particular quotation is so important that it is carved into the mantelpiece in the state dining room where it has inspired presidents ever since. So Adams moved into the White House, unfinished space, and he wanted his wife to come. He pleaded with her to come. She did come to this unfinished house and had to set up housekeeping. She used the room that today is the beautiful White House Library as her laundry room. That's where they did the washing. But then they had a challenge where to hang the washing, because do you want to hang the presidential knickers on a line outside so the whole city can see things flapping in the wind as they walk by? No, I don't think you do. So she hung the laundry in the East Room, where the fires were going 24 hours a day in order to dry out the plaster. That became her drying room. She was a very resourceful and practical New Englander. Eventually, after the presidency, Abigail lived to age 74 and died in 1818. John lived to 1826. He passed away on July 4th. 1826, and his last words were, Jefferson yet lives, not knowing that at Monticello in Virginia, Jefferson also was on his deathbed and passed away on July 4th, 1826. Now, my final famous First Lady is my favorite one because she is the most remarkable person, man or woman, I think, to ever have inhabited the White House. Dolly Payne Todd Madison, just an incredible, brilliant, effective, interesting woman. Dolly was born into a Quaker family, but being a Quaker didn't suit her, as you can see from this contemporary little portrait of her, because She's wearing a necklace and a pin and a fancy hat, and none of that was appropriate for a Quaker lady. But her family moved to Philadelphia, and her father's Quaker beliefs caused him to free the family's few enslaved people. So they were able to purchase and run a boarding house, which they ran with some success. Dolly met Mr. Payne, and they married. But shortly after, he and her father were taken ill. There was a yellow fever epidemic in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and they were killed. And that left Dolly and her mother alone to run the boarding house, which they did. And one of her frequent guests was Alexander Hamilton, who was a matchmaker and who said to Dolly, "I know just the person you should meet. That is my friend, Jemmy Madison." Now, he was 20 years older than she was, and her complete opposite in terms of temperament and personality. Madison was a brilliant man, but he was a shy, retiring personality. He was a small, short man, didn't stand out in a crowd. And Dolly was the polar opposite of this. Dolly was flamboyant. Dolly was an extrovert of extroverts. Dolly was always out there in public doing things and being with people and interacting with people. And they courted and they married, and she turned out to be his most fabulous asset. He became Secretary of State to President Jefferson, and because Jefferson was a widower, Mrs. Madison became his hostess at the White House, and as his hostess, she was networking. She was building a network of people who were going to support her husband in his bid for the presidency, and who would be their allies and friends throughout their public life. So here she is as a hostess at the White House, and again, as opposite from a Quaker as one can imagine. She was read out of the Quaker meeting for being very un-Quakerish. But she was a remarkable woman. She was so smart. And here she is again in color. It was said she dresses a queen, meaning she really looked regal in her fancy outfits, her clothes, her jewels. She often wore silk turbans with feathers and always a necklace. She was buxom. She wore low necklines and satin dresses. She was really behaved more like a queen than a first lady, I will say. And here she is at her most effective. There are probably people watching who may think that entertaining is an insignificant, superficial part of a president's success and agenda. I hope you're not paying attention, or you are paying attention here, because you could not be more wrong. Successful entertaining at the White House is critical to a president's success and to the forward movement of his agenda. And Dolly understood that to her core. And she moved the president's agenda forward with her entertainments, her Wednesday evening squeezes. And they were called squeezes because so many people came that everyone was jammed in all together, and everyone came. And why was that? Well, because on any other night of the week, the members of Congress knew that when they finished their business on Capitol Hill, they could walk back to their boarding house on Pennsylvania Avenue, get drunk in the parlor, stagger up to bed, the next day start all over again. But on Wednesday nights, they could show up at the president's house, get drunk on the president's punch, and have a grand time. And because it was so popular, everyone went. The members of Congress from both parties went, the members of the Supreme Court, social Washington, tradespeople, if they dressed up nicely, were welcome at the president's house. They all went. And can you believe it? That required something to happen that was absolutely astonishing, which is that everyone had to talk to everyone else. People who had different political views actually talked to each other. How are you getting on in Congress? Has your spouse been successful? Nowadays, it would have been, has your spouse found a job they like? Your children adjusted? And most importantly, what are the people back home in your district telling you they need us to do to help make their lives better? And well into my life in Washington, I'm a Washingtonian. My dad was a journalist, been in politics more or less all my life. That was the norm. People who didn't actually agree with each other still spoke to each other in the purpose of moving life forward, of doing things for people. That sadly is no longer the case. And I'll leave it to you if you think that has been good for us. But those were Dolly's squeezes, and they were incredibly important to the president's success. Well, everybody knew about his parties, including the British. So unfortunately, President Madison had to go to war with the British in 1812 because they insisted on stopping American ships at sea and taking sailors off those ships, saying, you can't prove those men are American. We say they're British, and therefore we have a right to take them off your ship and put them into the British Navy. This was a terrible affront to our sovereignty, and war was declared. Well, because the supply lines were very long, war dragged on for a very long time. This is a picture of what was happening in August of 1814. When the war came all the way to Bladensburg, Maryland, a far out suburb of the city of Washington. Hot August night, the president has gone out to review the battle and see what's happening. Dolly, as was her custom, has invited people for dinner. The servants have set out the food, the spirits, the wine, everything is on the tables. The guests have assembled. When a soldier comes riding up, breathlessly falls to the ground and breathes out, the battle is lost, everyone must flee, the British are about to march on Washington. This is a horrendous occurrence. So the invited guests start running around the White House, collecting everything valuable they can lay their hands on to take away for safekeeping. Things like Dolly's precious yellow velvet drapes from what is now the Blue Room, the Oval Room, all of the silver, the paintings, everything precious that they could lay their hands on, they took away. And the most precious thing in the house at the time was the painting you see in this depiction here of George Washington. It was bolted to the wall. They didn't have time to unbolt it, so they cut it out of the frame, rolled it all up, and sent it off to safety. And then Dolly was the last person to leave the house, and she wrote to her sister, and now, dear sister, I must leave this house, or the advancing party will make me a prisoner in it by filling up the road. She was talking about the people who were evacuating the city. The road I am directed to take. When I shall again write to you, or where I shall be tomorrow, I cannot tell. She did not know where she was going, where she might find safety. She did not know where her husband was, if perhaps he was overtaken by the British. This was a disaster of disasters. And in fact, horrible things happened. They burned the White House to the ground. Well, almost to the ground. They burned the Capitol. Everyone in the city of Washington observing these awful things happening. The Capitol wasn't even finished. The White House had barely been finished. When the war was over, the Madisons moved into Octagon House, which is just a few blocks away from the White House. And they continued his presidency there. Eventually, they retired, and Dolly never gave up her fashions. She was no longer First Lady, but she always wanted to dress like this. She was not well suited for a quiet, retiring life at Montpelier, beautiful plantation in Virginia. You should visit if you get the chance, but it was not at all suited to her because she missed the exciting life in Washington. She missed being in the center of things, and so much so that here she is. I could not believe it when I first saw this photograph. The idea that there's a photograph of Dolly Madison was just astonishing to me. But here she is with President Polk's family, shortly before her death in 1849. That elderly lady there is Dolly Madison, always involved in public life in Washington, never giving it up, always interested, always prodding the men to do what she thought was right, always encouraging them, always with an intense sense of duty. That brings me to the end of my visit with you about America's founding mothers, the revolutionaries. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you'd like to read more about my own story and what it was like to be at the White House, I encourage you to go to Amazon and get my book. Please take a look. And I encourage you to look some more on Viking.TV, where there are interviews and lectures by the most amazing and interesting people. I am honored to be in their company. And I hope you have enjoyed our time together today in honor of International Women's Day. Thank you for coming and attending. Goodbye.